Snow fell upon Mayfair with the patience of judgment, each flake settling upon iron railings and lacquered carriage roofs as though England itself were holding its breath. The ducal house blazed against the winter dark, windows aflame with beeswax light, servants moving like shadows behind glass. Inside, the Christmas ball unfurled according to ancient law, polished floors awaiting silk, chandeliers trembling above, music poised to begin. Names were announced, fortunes weighed in glances, and every arrival was measured for its usefulness. It was an evening built not for joy, but for display, and all present understood the price of misstep. She entered without announcement, as such women did. No footman called her lineage, no murmured admiration followed her steps. She came behind another lady, carrying herself with careful humility, gloved hands folded as though she might vanish between breaths. Her gown was modest but impeccably mended, its pale fabric chosen to offend no one and attract nothing. Those who noticed her did so with quick curiosity, then dismissal. She was known, after all, and known for the wrong reasons. She was the daughter of a clergyman who had fallen from grace. His name, once spoken from pulpits with gentle authority, had become a cautionary whisper. Debts, indiscretion, and an unguarded moment had undone him, and his ruin clung to her like a scent she could not wash away. Now she lived as a companion, useful only so long as she remained quiet, grateful, and small. She knew the rules. Tonight, more than ever, she meant to obey them. Across the room stood the Duke, observing not the dancers but the spaces between them. He was a widower of some years, his grief pressed into a shape that resembled composure. At 42, his hair showed silver at the temples, his expression schooled into restraint by habit and rank. He had buried a wife, buried expectation, and buried himself within duty. Society watched him with a careful interest reserved for men who possessed both power and solitude. He was aware of her before he looked at her. The hush that followed her arrival was nearly imperceptible, yet it reached him all the same. When he turned, he saw not scandal, but a woman standing as though the floor might betray her at any moment. There was nothing dramatic in her bearing, nothing that begged rescue. That, perhaps, was what struck him most. The music began. Couples arranged themselves with swift confidence, laughter carried lightly, and the evening resumed its practiced rhythm. She stood at the edge of the room, eyes lowered, counting measures until it might be acceptable to retreat. Her hands ached with the effort of stillness, and memory pressed close. Her father's study, emptied of books, her mother's quiet endurance, the long lessons in how to endure being seen without being wanted. It was then the Duke crossed the floor. His path was unhurried, deliberate, and with each step conversation softened, then ceased. He bowed. Properly. Publicly. He asked her to dance. The request landed like a dropped glass, shattering something unseen. She felt heat rush to her face, her pulse loud in her ears. To accept would be to presume, to invite comparison, to risk ridicule. To refuse would be to insult a duke and violate the sacred etiquette of the ballroom. For a breath, the world narrowed to that choice, and she thought of every door that had closed before she reached it. "I cannot," she said, her voice steady despite herself. It would be improper. Improper was a careful word. It carried apology without explanation, dignity without defiance. Around them, silence swelled. The musicians faltered. A lady's fan paused mid-flutter. This was not how such moments unfolded, not in rooms governed by precedent and fear. The Duke did not press her. He did not smile, nor did his expression harden. He studied her as though she had offered him something rare and costly, something purchased at great personal expense. Then he straightened, turned, and lifted his hand. The music ceased entirely. He spoke to the room, his tone calm, almost courteous. He thanked his guests for their attendance. He expressed regret for the suddenness. He instructed them, with the unquestioned authority of his title, to take their leave. It was not a command dressed as anger, but as finality, and that made it more unsettling still. Shock rippled outward, swift and contained. Chairs scraped. Murmurs broke free. Ladies gathered shawls with trembling fingers. Gentlemen bowed, uncertain whether they had witnessed gallantry or madness. One by one, the room emptied, pride carrying confusion out into the cold. The great doors closed, and the sound echoed like a verdict. She stood frozen, the enormity of it pressing upon her chest. This was not protection as she understood it. It was exposure of another kind, dangerous and irreversible. Alone now with the most powerful man present, she felt the full weight of consequence descend, and wondered whether ruin had simply chosen a different shape. Time seemed to hesitate with him. She felt suddenly young and terribly old, balanced between obedience and some unnamed courage. Every lesson she had learned urged silence, retreat, gratitude for survival. Yet his attention, unwavering and unadorned, suggested another possibility, one she had never permitted herself to imagine. Around them lay the remnants of an evening undone, scattered programs, cooling wax, and the faint scent of pine carried indoors. The candles burned lower. Snow brushed the tall windows. The Duke looked at her once more, not as society saw her, but as something singular. He drew a breath, as though about to speak, and she understood that whatever followed would alter her life beyond repair. The silence pressed close, heavy with promise and peril alike, and she held herself still, knowing that the next word spoken in that emptied room would determine whether she remained a shadow or stepped, at last, into the light. History, waiting quietly nearby, prepared to witness the smallest, bravest defiance. Morning arrived with consequence. London woke already informed, for scandal traveled faster than carriages and lingered longer than candle smoke. By breakfast, the story had acquired embellishment. The Duke dismissed the room in fury, the woman had wept, an engagement had been hinted, a disgrace confirmed. None of it was precisely true, yet truth mattered little once tongues found purchase. The ton required no facts, only permission to judge. She learned of it through silence. No reprimand came, no dismissal, yet the household shifted around her as though she were newly fragile. Doors closed more softly. Conversations halted when she entered. Her employer, a distant relation by marriage, addressed her with careful politeness, the sort that acknowledged usefulness while withdrawing warmth. Gratitude, she reminded herself, must suffice. She had not been turned out. Not yet. She spent the morning mending lace that did not need mending, her fingers moving from habit while her thoughts returned to the ballroom. The Duke's face, unreadable. The sudden quiet. The weight of having been chosen, if only briefly, and the terror that followed. She did not allow herself to name what stirred beneath the fear. Longing was a luxury reserved for women with protection. By noon, a note arrived. Cream paper. Heavy seal. Delivered not by a messenger boy but by a footman in ducal livery, who bowed as though she were accustomed to such treatment. Her hands trembled as she broke the wax. The message was brief, formal, unassailable. The Duke expressed regret for any distress his actions may have caused. He asked permission to ensure her continued comfort during the remainder of her stay. Nothing more. Nothing less. She read it twice, then once again, searching for hidden meaning. There was none. That, perhaps, was the most unsettling part. In a world that traded in implication, he offered clarity. She folded the note carefully and placed it beneath her sewing basket, as though hiding a flame. The Duke, meanwhile, faced his own reckoning. His steward informed him of 3 cancelled visits and 1 letter from a cousin advising discretion. His solicitor hinted at political inconvenience. None spoke directly of the woman, yet she stood between every line. He listened without interruption, his expression composed, his mind elsewhere. He had not acted in anger. That knowledge steadied him now. He had acted in refusal. Memory returned unbidden. His late wife, once mocked for her provincial accent, the way she had stood straighter under scrutiny, the promise he had failed to keep when illness took her. He had learned then how easily society excused cruelty when dressed as custom. Last night, he had declined to play his part. By afternoon, whispers reached the house where she resided. An invitation withdrawn. A call postponed. Each small omission carried its own rebuke. She accepted them silently, reminding herself that this was the price of survival. Yet beneath the resignation lay a quiet, stubborn ember, newly lit, that refused to be smothered. It was fanned by another gesture. That evening, a parcel arrived, modest in size, accompanied by no letter. Inside lay a pair of gloves, fine kid leather, unremarkable save for their quality. They were not extravagant, nor intimate, but practical, unmistakably new. She understood at once. They were meant to replace the pair she had dropped the night before, trampled in the confusion. He had noticed. He had remembered. She pressed the gloves to her palms and felt something loosen within her chest. No man of his standing noticed such things without intention. This was not courtship as novels described it. This was recognition. Dinner that night was strained. Conversation turned, with feigned casualness, to the Duke's eccentricities. She was not asked to contribute. She was not asked to leave. When the candles burned low, she excused herself, the gloves hidden beneath her shawl, and stood for a moment by the window. Snow fell again, quieter now, as though the city itself were listening. Across town, the Duke did the same. He stood alone in his library, gloves discarded upon his desk, contemplating the narrowing path before him. He knew the rules she lived under. He had benefited from them all his life. To challenge them required patience, not spectacle. He resolved then to proceed as one who understood restraint, and who meant to use it as a blade. The next days unfolded with careful precision. He did not call. He did not send flowers. Instead, he ensured, through intermediaries and unremarkable kindnesses, that her position remained secure. He silenced one rumor by correcting it gently. He ignored another, allowing it to wither without opposition. Each act was small, deniable, yet together they formed a shield. She felt the change as one feels a shift in weather. The air grew less hostile. A greeting returned. A glance softened. She remained cautious, yet something within her began to lift its head. She had not asked for rescue. He had not offered it. What he offered was space. On the fourth day, a message arrived requesting her presence for a brief conversation, at an hour and place beyond reproach. She held the card, her breath unsteady, knowing that whatever had begun in silence now required voice. The gloves lay beside her, waiting. She rose, composed herself, and stepped forward, unaware that this measured crossing, undertaken without witnesses, would prove more daring than any dance. She arrived at the appointed house just as the light began to fade, when London softened its edges and respectability guarded every threshold. The room prepared for their meeting was neither grand nor intimate, chosen with deliberate care. A morning room overlooked a small enclosed garden, winter-bare and orderly, the fire laid but not yet lit. Nothing about it suggested secrecy, yet everything suggested intention. She paused before entering, steadying herself with a breath that tasted of restraint. The Duke rose when she was announced. He did not move toward her at once, allowing the space between them to remain untouched, as though acknowledging that it belonged to her as much as to him. He bowed, not deeply, but with sincerity, and she answered in kind. The silence that followed was not awkward, only dense, filled with what neither had yet said. "I am grateful that you came," he began, his voice measured, carrying no presumption. "I wish to speak with you plainly, if you will allow it." She inclined her head. "Plainness is a kindness," she replied, surprised by her own steadiness. They sat opposite one another, the small table between them a necessary boundary. For a moment, he studied his hands, folded loosely, as though assembling the words with care. She noticed the faint scar across one knuckle, evidence of a life that had known consequence long before her. "I owe you an apology," he said at last. "Not for what I did, but for the weight it placed upon you." The acknowledgment struck her more deeply than any defense might have done. "You are not responsible for the judgments of others," she answered, though the habit of deflection came easily. "I am accustomed to them." "I know," he said quietly, and the simplicity of it unsettled her. "That is precisely what troubled me." He spoke then of the ballroom, of the moment he saw her standing alone, carrying her history like an invisible mark. He did not dramatize it, nor did he elevate himself. He described only a refusal, his own, to permit a public humiliation that required her consent. As he spoke, she understood that he had not dismissed the room for her sake alone, but because he could no longer bear to witness the ritual unchallenged. She listened without interruption, her gaze fixed upon the garden beyond the glass. When he finished, the silence returned, altered now, softened at the edges. "You risked much," she said finally, "for someone you did not know." "I knew enough," he replied. "I knew you had the courage to say no." The word lingered between them. Courage had never been applied to her before. She felt it press against old wounds, testing them. "I did not refuse out of bravery," she said. "I refused because I could not survive the cost of compliance." "That is bravery," he said, without argument. She drew a breath, and with it came a truth she had long kept folded away. She spoke of her father's fall, not with bitterness, but with clarity. Of how quickly respect could evaporate, leaving obligation in its place. Of how she had learned to shrink herself, to preempt judgment by embracing invisibility. Each sentence cost her something, yet with each one, she felt the burden shift. He listened as though nothing else existed. When she faltered, he did not fill the space. He allowed her the dignity of completion. "I do not seek restoration," she concluded. "Only the right to exist without being examined." He leaned forward then, not crossing the boundary, but acknowledging it. "I cannot undo what has been done to you," he said. "Nor can I promise ease. What I can promise is that I will not be silent when silence becomes complicity." She met his gaze for the first time, fully, and found no triumph there, only resolve. The realization unsettled her more than admiration might have done. "You owe me nothing," he continued. "I ask for nothing. I wished only to tell you that you are not alone in this moment, whether or not our paths continue to cross." The restraint of it struck her like a revelation. He offered presence without claim, protection without possession. In a world governed by transaction, this was radical. The fire was lit then by a servant who departed at once, leaving warmth to fill the room gradually. She felt it reach her hands, easing the chill she had not noticed before. "I do not know what to do with such generosity," she admitted. "Then do nothing," he said gently. "Allow it to exist." They sat a while longer, speaking of inconsequential matters, of weather and books, of the quiet pleasures that survived scrutiny. When at last she rose to leave, the moment felt complete, not unresolved, yet weighted with promise. At the door, he spoke once more. "Should you ever wish to dance," he said carefully, "it will be because you desire it, and not because the room demands it." She paused, her hand on the latch. "Then perhaps," she replied, "one day I shall." Outside, night had settled, calm and cold. As she stepped into it, she understood that something irrevocable had occurred, not loudly, but with the precision of a vow unspoken. Neither of them yet named it, but both carried it forward, aware that what had begun in restraint now required courage of a far more dangerous kind. The pressure arrived not as outrage, but as counsel, measured and persistent, delivered by those who believed themselves benevolent. The Duke received letters advising patience, reminding him of obligations to lineage and estate, warning that kindness could be mistaken for intention. He read them without irritation, folded them neatly, and set them aside. He had chosen his course, and he understood that restraint, once declared, must be defended with consistency rather than spectacle. She felt the countercurrent more sharply. An old acquaintance resurfaced with a practiced smile and a question too lightly phrased to be innocent. A matron spoke of gratitude and opportunity as though they were interchangeable. The past, thought buried, was drawn into lamplight and examined anew. She answered with courtesy, refusing to be baited into explanation. What steadied her was not certainty of outcome, but the memory of being heard without interruption. The Duke did not summon her again. Instead, he appeared where propriety allowed, neither seeking nor avoiding her presence. At a charitable committee, he listened while she spoke with clarity about needs she knew intimately. At a small musical evening, he remained seated when others rose, acknowledging her arrival without command. Each instance recalibrated the room, quietly insisting upon her place within it. Rumor sharpened in response. Some named him foolish, others romantic, many calculating. A relation suggested a swift resolution through distance. He declined. The estate, he said, had weathered worse than opinion. When pressed, he spoke of stewardship, of the example set by conduct rather than decree. His calm unsettled those who relied upon reaction. The decisive moment came with a notice circulated discreetly, alleging impropriety between them and implying advantage sought by her. It reached her hands folded with incivility, a poison administered politely. She read it once and felt the old instinct to recede, to accept diminishment as protection. Then she remembered the room emptied without apology, and she stood. She sought the Duke not in secrecy but in daylight, requesting an audience that would be recorded and witnessed. When they met, she did not plead. She stated facts with precision, naming dates, words, absences. She asked not for defense, but for acknowledgment of truth. Her voice did not waver. The composure surprised them both. He responded as he had resolved he would. He addressed the allegation publicly, neither inflaming nor minimizing it. He confirmed their meetings as proper, their intentions as honorable, and her character as unimpeachable. He offered evidence where evidence was required, and silence where it was not. The effect was immediate and irrevocable. What followed was not universal approval, but clarity. Invitations returned altered, cautious yet genuine. Doors opened with deliberation rather than curiosity. She accepted what was offered and declined what was not. The balance, once fragile, began to hold. It was winter still when he asked her to walk with him in the garden behind the morning room. Snow lay thin upon the paths, the air clean and exacting. He spoke without preamble, acknowledging the cost she had borne and the choice before him. He would proceed, he said, only with her consent, and only toward a future that did not require her erasure. She considered the offer not as rescue, but as partnership. She spoke of her limits, her need to retain work, to remain useful beyond ornament. He agreed without hesitation, naming the respect owed to purpose. When he asked, finally, if she would allow him to declare himself, the question carried no assumption, only hope. She answered yes, and in doing so claimed herself entire. The declaration was made simply, without spectacle, framed as intention rather than conquest. Society adjusted as it always does, discovering principles it had misplaced. Some praised his honor, others her restraint. Neither mattered. What mattered was the steadiness that followed. On Christmas evening, a year after the ball, a small gathering assembled beneath softened light. Music played, unhurried. When he offered his hand, she took it without fear. They moved together across the floor, not to demonstrate triumph, but to inhabit a choice freely made. The past did not vanish. It was carried, integrated, rendered useful. In the weeks that followed, they practiced the discipline they had chosen. He learned the cadence of her days, the hours she reserved for service and study, the silences she required to remain whole. She learned the weight of his responsibilities, the patience demanded by land and tenants, the way decisions echoed beyond intention. They spoke often, plainly, and when disagreement arose, it was met without retreat. Each concession was named, each boundary respected, and from this care a sturdier intimacy emerged. On a cold afternoon, she visited the church where her father had preached, now quiet, its doors newly repaired through an anonymous gift that restored nothing but dignity. She did not linger. The gesture required no acknowledgment. It was enough to know that mercy could be enacted without announcement. When spring approached, he asked again, not because the answer might change, but because consent deserved repetition. She affirmed it, smiling at the care embedded in the asking. The future, they agreed, would be built incrementally, with attention and courage in equal measure. Thus the story concluded not with conquest, but with continuity, a life assembled through choice. What endured was not the emptied ballroom, but the habit formed thereafter, to look, to listen, and to refuse the easy cruelty of custom. In that refusal, they found a union equal to their time and truer than its permission.